chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. The Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. The Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning.
Vidodakapana jala gambhira dhara murtiye namaha samanta bhadraya samanta sparanatishe nabhavo nabhibhavo sindhachedo napi shashvataha nanityo napi nityastvam advayaya namostute. Chiringi gena bhuzage dala di mumbo razane ganantandre sholo tongwai lodo babena wa chande sol omanchagi bodane dusan sange kungi ngoni. So good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all. Some familiar faces, some not so familiar yet. Looking forward to spending the weekend with some of you, and of course with Roshi Joan and Kigaku Noah, and I know that Noah's son's coming up on his first birthday, so congratulations, Noah. And so yes, in any case, I wanted to talk about lineage in part because I think there's a way in which, as Roshi Joan was saying, we're in a very political time, so to speak, and lineage actually is a very important aspect of politics in a way. It's also a very important aspect of leadership from a Buddhist standpoint, but it's really also central to Buddhist practice. I've been thinking about it, though, not only because of, some of the obvious ways in which it's important in Buddhist practice, and we'll talk about that, but also because for a couple of reasons. One of them is when we went to Dharamsala together, Roshi Joan and I, we were there with some very venerable teachers who were all showing, all getting a little long in the tooth, as it were. And just that sense of the vastness of time in which these relatively short lifetimes, as they are proceeding, as our teachers are getting older, the vastness of the practice of the Dharma, which is not just about this lifetime. Even if you don't hold a multi-life perspective, the Dharma is not just about this lifetime. It's come to us from thousands of years, and of course the tradition would say since beginningless time, actually. Especially if we think of it in terms of the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal Dharma. But also, and so I saw some teachers, and I'll say a few more things about that, but I also have lately been spending quite a lot of time, somehow, this just happens in my life, I just sort of get pulled in some direction, and then suddenly there I am doing something that I didn't expect to be doing. And that direction lately has actually been working with indigenous practitioners, First Nations peoples. And I was just lately at a very interesting meeting at University of California, Berkeley, sponsored by the Mind and Life Institute and facilitated by John Powell's Center for Othering and Belonging. And it was with a number of indigenous practitioners who are working with plant medicines. And we were trying to really work through some of the issues around the ethics of the scientific research that I'm also now involved in, and that actually Roshi Joan was a pioneer in some years ago. So Roshi, hopefully we get a chance to talk more about that meeting. It was really interesting. It's led by Dr. Uriah Seligman, and included some really fascinating practitioners. But one of the things that I really liked about it is it was led by by Uriah and her colleagues, all of whom were co-authors on a paper that may be coming out soon on this topic. And we sat down to dinner. We had the dinner the first night, the usual kind of thing. You sit down and you have a sort of introductory dinner for your workshop. And it was time we were going to introduce ourselves. But then I'm getting ready to say, well, like Noah said, I'm the distinguished professor of contemplative humanities. And I was going to talk about where my degrees come from and what I've written lately and, blah, 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 blah. But, and they said, so we want you to introduce yourself, but don't tell us about your university or any of that. We want to know about your place and your ancestors. That's how we want you to introduce. And then, I think I was last or next to last. And so I heard some amazing stories, both from the practitioners themselves, and then there were just 3 scientists. I was counting as a scientist in this particular context. The 3, the other 2 scientists who were there, and a couple of the facilitators, including John Powell. And in a way, what it really brought to home was that sense of connection in the lineage, right? But also that lineage is complicated because ancestors, when we think of this in terms of ancestors, we're of course talking about actually our kin, right? In that view, this is, not all indigenous peoples are definitely not the same, just in case you didn't know. And so all indigenous traditions are they're different, the different perspectives, when they're working in healing, they're not necessarily using the same plants if they're using plants. And even if they are using them, they may use different parts or they may use them in different ways. So there's a tremendous amount of variety. And there was also at that meeting, variety in that practice, but there's also some things that kind of overlap, and one of them is the basic idea of kinship, which is fascinating. And as many of you know, part of the way that the Bodhisattva, and I think all of us probably here know what that term means, but I'll just remind ourselves that this is a being, a sattva, who is intent on awakening, Bodhi, for the sake of all sentient beings, to serve all sentient beings so that they may relieve their suffering and realize the highest flourishing. And a bodhisattva always has bodhicitta, that mind, chitta, that's intent on attaining awakening for the sake of others. And so for the bodhisattva, that one of the ways in which we cultivate that awakening mind, bodhicitta, is actually by seeing literally all beings as our kin, right? All beings are part of our family. In a sense, we all have the same ancestors, therefore. It's quite interesting to think about that relationship. There are even some indigenous peoples who do espouse a kind of reincarnation, but it's actually a reincarnation of your kin, so that you may be the reincarnation of your own great-grandparent or great-great-grandparent. So it's a slightly different, overlapping, but actually slightly different way of thinking about our relationship to other beings, to all beings even, that idea of kinship. And it is, I think, a really important trope, a really important metaphor for Bodhisattva practice and the cultivation of compassion. But of course, also when you talk about lineage, or when I was asked to talk about my ancestors, I found myself talking about my biological ancestors, those kin. I decided, I was there with the scientist, Dr. Keltner, and I think we both decided that in the end, we're actually nomads. We're kind of landless people in a way, which is, I think, very typical for many modern people, maybe especially academics. But then I also realized that a big part of my ancestors, and that this is a theme actually in Buddhist practice, that my ancestors are also my lineage of teachers. So that in a sense, what I'm inheriting, so if we think about it from that perspective of First Nations practice, of indigenous practice, like there's a sense in which what we receive and the strength we have, the capacity we have, the resilience we have, and clearly these people have been incredibly resilient because, of course, many communities have disappeared entirely, but despite everything, many have also managed to survive and even thrive at points. That what we receive is that strength, that capacity to not only continue our way of life, as it were, but actually to learn from those challenges to get even stronger. So that sense of the ancestors, in a sense, empowering one is really important in that practice. But that's also a real important feature of the lineage in Buddhist practice. So I know that lineage is extremely important in Zen. It's maybe one of the traditions that thematizes it the most, maybe the most. Yes, Roshi says yes. I think that is true. It's also extremely important in Tibetan Buddhism in general. It's because of Tantra, actually, and even especially in the non-dual practice styles of Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. But I just want to say that overall, lineage is crucial throughout Buddhism. You don't really find, even though there are traditions like Zen, like Mahamudra and Dzogchen that emphasize it very heavily, it's a crucial part of all Buddhist lineages, at least the ones. No, I've never heard of one in which it isn't crucially important. It's actually in monastic contexts. One's name, traditionally in the ancient monasteries of India, all of which have now disappeared, of course, you could identify who was whose student very often by the name, because the name would actually include some aspect of the teacher's name. All of the ordinations that were given were in a kind of lineage. It's almost like the monastic community was, and now you're new kin. And the monastics are inheriting the wisdom of their ancestors, which is not their biological ancestors, but their monastic ancestors. So that again, that sense of the strength, the capacity for resilience, the wisdom, the insight, that's coming down now through a different kind of descent, so to speak. So lineage is crucially important throughout the Buddhist world, I would say. And part of the way that it is important is that it is, what you might say is that it structures the community in a certain way. It also acts as in other words, I'm going to reflect here a little bit on another scholar that we heard, or one of the scholars that we heard in Dharamsala, Joe Heinrich, who I really enjoyed his work, and kudos to Roshi for working a lot with Joe. And I think he might have been your idea as an invitee. I'm not sure, but in any case, yes, Roshi's idea. Thank you. It was a great idea. So Joe does a lot of work on what's called cultural evolution, and some of you may be familiar with this idea. So this is the idea that actually our biological evolution or genetic evolution is also going alongside cultural evolution, and that there's an interaction between the two. So a really simple example of that interaction that Joe used, and Joe has written a book called The Weirdest People in the World, which is about Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies, and how odd people are from those places. And he's also written a book called The Secret of Our Success, which is really where he lays out these issues around cultural evolution. I've been working through the Weird book and looking forward to the other one, but also managed to have a number of conversations, and of course hear Joe in Dharamsala. And a really simple example of this actually is fire. So, if we all had, let's just suppose we were all born without and that no one knew how to make fire. Like you're just born, and we'll set aside all the problems of, how you're going to survive if you're a modern human without fire. But just pretend, somehow, okay, nobody knows how to make fire. Well, and there are no stoves, by the way, so you can't just go over to the stove and press a button. Are we going to discover fire? I mean, it's a really interesting question. Like, if somehow the knowledge of fire disappeared, even though there are 3 billion people on the planet, or whatever, how many, I lost track, would anyone find fire in our generation? Would anyone discover fire? So somebody did, or some buddies maybe, and then that knowledge is transmitted. And because of that transmission of that knowledge, the point being that that's not knowledge that could just be discovered each generation. That's knowledge that actually has to be transmitted from one generation to the next. Because if it's not transmitted, we're not going to just figure out how to make fire. So that knowledge is transmitted, and actually as a result of the transmission of that knowledge, because now humans can cook, therefore their jaws become much smaller than other primates, their teeth become smaller and weaker, and their intestines actually get shorter because they don't need long intestines to digest raw food in the same way. So literally, our cultural transmission of the knowledge of fire changed our genetic transmission. It changed our genetics. Joe talks about also reading, actually, that so you can have ways, and so reading, actually, the skill of reading actually directly affects the brain. We don't even know how much it might be connecting the genetic transmission of the genes relevant to the development of human brains, but we do know epigenetically that it does affect human brains. It affects, for example, the capacity for facial recognition. It actually decreases that capacity, so that if you're a modern, American, educated, therefore, you can read, probably you do a lot of reading, that actually means that your capacity for facial recognition is decreased. And that becomes a cultural feature. So we learn, so part of the idea here is that there's a transmission of culture. And when we talk about lineage in the Buddhist context, we're also transmitting a particular kind of culture through the lineage. And some of what we're transmitting actually is an ethics, right? A moral practice. Some of what we're transmitting is even an aesthetics, right? A sense of what is beautiful. Some of what we're transmitting are ritual activities, ritual processes. But of course, the core of what we're transmitting for the Bodhisattva is we're transmitting wisdom and compassion. So that transmission, wisdom and compassion, the idea here, and this, I teach freshmen. I teach on the two ends of the scale. I teach freshmen and like fifth-year doctoral students, and I don't seem to teach anybody in between. Sometimes they seem very similar, and sometimes they're very different. If I say to them, I point this out to them, especially the American students, they start to feel a little challenged because there's a sense in which, well, wait a second, I'm supposed to be lifting myself up on my own bootstraps. Aren't I supposed to be this independent person, this person who is, making it on their own, who in a sense, is not tied to those ancestors, is not tied to some kind of lineage, nobody's going to tell me what to do. I can do this on my own. So that incredibly individualistic perspective of American culture, the individualism of American culture, I think flies in the face, first of all, in very obvious ways in the indigenous context, right? That, like the cognitive dissonance there is incredible. But it's also flies in the face of Buddhism. Because there is, just like fire, we're not going to discover wisdom and compassion on our own. That doesn't mean it's not there. Fire's there. Wisdom and compassion, especially for the kinds of traditions that I work with, and I think arguably for Zen and as well. It's like Dharmakaya. These are just innate features of Dharmakaya. They're the innate features of reality. They're innate to the human mind. But obviously, if that's one thing to say, just like fire is like the potential for fire. You've got fuel and, there it is everywhere. Lots of things you could burn. The wisdom and compassion are innate to all sentient beings. But if it were that simple, then, just the fact that it was innate and that's it. And then, well, everyone would be a Buddha, I guess. And then the midterm elections would just be about who's the better Buddha, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I think we wouldn't be having nearly as many problems as we have. If people could just kind of discover their own awakened nature, their own Buddha nature simply on their own. So it's not, but that's a challenge for our society. Like, I'm going to do this myself. I'm going to figure this out myself. I'm going to learn this myself. Many of you on this gathered here together now, virtually, probably don't relate to that. It's certainly, if you're not from America, you may not relate to it at all. Even if you're not a man, you may not relate to it. If you're from a different community, if you're from a minoritized community, you may not relate to it. But it is a dominant aspect of our society. And so when we think of leaders, we often think of leaders as being like, these independent people who are kind of coming up with it themselves, the revolutionaries even, right? Who are just going to start from ground zero. So that doesn't make any sense in the Buddhist context. Without the lineage, we're like people without fire. And we're going to be out of luck. At the same time, one of the insights of, you could say, this Buddhist approach to lineage, which is a little bit different than, just appealing to our ancestors, is, so we have that kind of lineage of wisdom and compassion, and the idea that we're just going to come up with that ourselves, and that I could become like a teacher who doesn't need anybody. I mean, it just kind of, it's almost silly to think of that, right? But ridiculous. Although there may be teachers out there like that, Western teachers. I don't really know. Just going to do my own new thing. But on the other hand, we do have another lineage, which you could call our kind of samsaric lineage. Our other ancestors, which is to say that, why is it that we can spontaneously, so maybe some of you, let me just speak for myself, some of you maybe could spontaneously realize your own Buddha nature. You might think you're a Pacceka Buddha, the so-called solitary realizer, but they actually have a teacher. It's just secret. So this would be a new thing in the Buddhist world where you could just discover it yourself, but I'm just going to grant that, somebody out there could do that. Sure. Why not? Like Andy Carr, I think is on the, maybe Andy could do that. But, I couldn't. And the question is, well, why not? And one reason not is that I also have, in a sense, another lineage, right? I have something else that I'm inheriting, which is basically samsara. So, from the Buddhist standpoint, someone who's moving into a leadership position, to the extent that they have, whether as a teacher in the community or what have you, to the extent that there's wisdom and compassion blossoming, this is coming from the lineage, actually. But also to the extent that any of us are, ignorant, uncompassionate, lacking wisdom, filled with kleshas, there's a Buddhist way in which we could say, sure, that's kind of about ourselves, that's about our karma. But it's also, and here this is a little untraditional, I'll be honest, it's also about living in this world, this samsaric world. Like we have a collective karma that we're dealing with, a kind of system that we are embedded in. And that is also part of that heritage. And if we say, well, why can't we just discover our own Buddha nature? Why isn't it just obvious to us? Well, part of the reason is that that other heritage of our culture, of our society, and then, of course, our own family heritages in many cases are blocking that. And it's really important for us not to pretend that we can just kind of step into the Buddhist world and drop that other lineage. That, I think, is crucially important, that we recognize that each of us is already a composite being. To quote the late great Thich Nhat Hanh, wonderful teacher, where he liked to say, whatever, the cup, the glass is made, I don't have a cup, no, I'm sorry, but the glass is made of non-glass elements, right? John Donne is made of non-John Donne elements. We are all made of, part of what we are made of is our heritage, actually, our ancestors, if you like, our culture, our people, even if we don't have that same tight sense of kinship. And I, like one of the ways I say this with my freshman students in our class, the Art and Science of Human Flourishing, our experimental class, it's like, okay, everybody, please give me a completely original thought. And I say, then I say, okay, here's mine. I go, and they what? Because you can't, even if the minute you're using language, it's not original. Right? Did I make up my own language? Is that going to work out very well? I can't even make it make sense to myself. So we have to, even our thoughts, the way we move our bodies, these are already a product of our personal histories, of our karma, but also of our collective histories, our collective karma. And the challenge for the leader, the teacher in the Buddhist world is, how do we work with that as well? Not just pretend we can step into this pure space of the lineage and be bathed in wisdom and compassion and simply channel our wisdom, the wisdom and compassion. And there are a few reasons. I mean, that wouldn't even really, from the Buddhist standpoint, that's not even such a good thing. We don't want the next generation of teachers, the next generation of leaders in the Buddhist community to just be, reflections of the previous generation. And here, one of the things that did prompt me to think of this topic when Kigaku Noah asked me about it is when I was in India, I saw my old teacher, Bob Thurman. Had not seen him in a long time. And I don't know, several years before the pandemic. And I spent a lot of, Bob was very important for me when I first started studying Buddhism when I went to Amherst College in 1981, I think. Getting old. And so, and then Bob, it was really wonderful to see him and his wife, Nina. And then we had an exchange, and then actually I had to leave. And then I later found out that the conversation continued, and then Nina had wanted to convey a message to me that she had conveyed to Richie Davidson, who was there. And Bob wrote me an email, and he said, Nina had a last message for you that evening. You had already left, which is around the wonderful exchange in the Blue Cliff record, translation by T.J. Cleary, where the commentator quotes and remarks on what Pai Chang says to Huangpo, excuse my pronunciation. Pai Chang says to Huangpo, if your view equals your teacher, you have less than half your teacher's virtue. Only when your wisdom goes beyond your teacher are you worthy to pass on the transmission. And of course, the implication was that I was worthy. I just want you to know I don't feel worthy, but I really appreciated Nina sending me that message. So how does that happen? How does the student, in a sense, not just kind of reflect the teacher, just simply channel the teacher, become a sort of pale reflection, perhaps, of the teacher or the many teachers even, but rather takes that lineage and then enhances it somehow? I think where that's happening is with the other lineage, the samsaric lineage, is working with that other stuff, is becoming responsive to the current context, the current cultural context, the way the world is now, but also seeing, and this is key, seeing in the lineage where samsara is present, where ignorance, where negative mental states, where attachments, where jealousies, where those are present, and being very clear about that. Because one of the things that is really difficult in the practice of the lineage is the challenge to see Buddha nature in the teacher fully manifest. Because, there are some teachers out there who are true Buddhas. And here I'm really getting a little dicey, I have to tell you, because in my lineage, you really have to see your teacher as Buddha, like fully, really a Buddha, fully awakened being. And yet somehow in the Tibetan world, people seem to be, and I almost think here of like, in a way, which I hope is appropriate, is, it's almost a little bit like that sort of double exposure that W.B. Du Bois talks about, from being a person who sort of sees others seeing them, sees themselves one way and others are seeing them in another way, right? This is that capacity somehow to kind of be in two worlds at once, which is not always easy and can be very destructive. But maybe sometimes that capacity is also a skill, to be able to see the Buddha nature in our teachers and also see somehow that there's a person there who's stuck in samsara too. And to be the kind of teacher, the kind of leader who can acknowledge that, and who is not pretending that that's not the case. Right? Is not trying to cover it up somehow. And is really acknowledging it. That, I think, first of all, in most of the lineages, is not something, I think, definitely, I don't know about Zen. Roshi's the Roshi around here. But I would say in the Tibetan world, there is this kind of implicit, or even sometimes explicit knowledge, like awareness, like, yes, the teacher is a Buddha and, he poops in the morning. Right? Yeah. Okay. Do Buddhas poop or not? It's like, interesting theological question. And how does it smell? I'm sorry. But, so that capacity to sort of see the lineage, the Bodhisattva lineage in our teachers and in ourselves, and then also to work with the other crud in each generation and to change, to work with that, to be responsive to what's happening right now, but then also to be working with the lineage. And I don't think it's always like, just a linear thing. It can kind of go up and down. So there can be times when there are real challenges to the lineage, and then times when, things go really well. So I don't think that it's just a simple linear process. But I do think it's something that when we think of leadership, and so you can take that and you can extract it, you can put it into other contexts as well. Whatever kind of leadership you're in, you've almost always, certainly implicitly you've inherited something, but often one is, inheriting, like I'm chair of my department right now, and so I have a whole lot of stuff that I've inherited. And some of that's the good stuff, and some of that's the not really good stuff. So how do you work with, how do you transform from the standpoint of wisdom and compassion, transform what's already, it's not like you're changing samsara, you're working with the lineage itself. Like that challenge is a tremendous challenge. So one thought might be, well, maybe we don't need the lineage. I've already explained that if you're a human, you have your ancestors, for better or worse, right? We are already fully enculturated beings. We can't just sort of fly off into some pure place where we're going to be devoid of culture and I'm going to be free of all of the past. It's just gone, like James Joyce's character, Stephen Dedalus, who's like to say, nightmare is history is a nightmare from which I'm struggling to awake. It's a classic modernist attitude, right? The past is bad. No, that's not going to work. Of course, the other extreme, and interesting, Bob actually wrote something like this about the sort of Western modernism and Asian conservatism in his introduction to the original version. I think it's and I think there's a revised version. It's there too. Introduction to his translation of the Holy Teachings of Vimalakirti. Like, yeah, the West, like, modern West, everything's, the history is like, well, who cares? We want to progress, forward, new stuff. And a kind of conservatism in Buddhist lineages would be, no, it's all the good stuff is in the past, and like now it's just, terrible. It's just decline everywhere. Probably both of those extremes are, well, they're extremes. We're not going to just get rid of the past. We also don't just want to channel the past. What we wanted is to become this kind of dynamic, something that dynamically informs us and gives us a kind of freedom in the present. That's what the lineage, that's what wisdom and compassion can do for us. It gives us freedom in the present to work with the samsaric aspect of the lineage and of course, our samsaric world. And one place to think about that is to think about, as I said, I'd say, like, why is the lineage so important, especially in non-dual traditions, is the special role that the lineage plays in those traditions, like Zen, like Mahamudra, and like Dzogchen. So, and I'll end on this note in the next few minutes or so. So as you know, right, we talk about wisdom and compassion. Well, why do we talk about that? I think many of you are already familiar with this, but just a quick review. What wisdom does is wisdom uproots the ignorance that is the engine of samsara. Ignorance that drives, like, I want this, I don't want that, I want this, or even we want this, we don't want that. You're good, you're bad, I'm this is that. The sort of the essentialism, the grasping, the rejecting, all rooted in ignorance. And what wisdom does is wisdom uproots that, completely transforms it. And compassion then replaces the attachment and the aversion that produced samsara out of ignorance and replaces it with love. Love and compassion are the engine of remaking samsara, of making the Buddha field. So that's what wisdom and compassion do. But in the non-dual traditions, wisdom is really about, when we say non-dual, why are we saying that? Because in those traditions, they emphasize the idea that the whole subject-object structure, our experience of the world is out there, there's some kind of subjectivity or consciousness in here, out there, in here, that's the most fundamental expression of ignorance. That sense of duality, of out there, in here. And everything is built on that. Like a language in particular, all capacity for thought, whether it involves language or not. All conceptualizations, all what's called parikalpa, right? All constructions are built on that duality. And we think all that stuff is real, like all of those constructions, including the cultures, right? And the cultural heritage and even the lineage itself that we can cling to. So seeing through that, being able to transform those structures into the Buddha field requires that we see through their seeming reality. And in the non-dual traditions, the way we do that is this kind of, we don't just take the building piece by piece down. We just go right to the foundation and take it out. And the foundation is duality, so we just go straight to non-duality. Boom, right? And that non-dual experience, however, and additional claim is that non-dual experience is already a feature of your experience in every moment. We are already always experiencing non-duality, non-dual awareness. And in fact, that is Buddha nature. And if we think of the dynamic aspect of that non-dual awareness as a kind of compassion, then there it is, wisdom and compassion. Is right there, is that non-dual awareness itself. We just don't know what's happening, but it's happening all the time, is the claim. But part of the reason we don't know what's happening is we're trying to say, oh, it's this. No, it's that. Maybe it's over here, or it's there. It's in here. No, wait, it's out there. I mean, maybe that person can tell. Oh, no, this person can tell me. I should read this book? Or no, wait a second. No. Wait, what? I go here or go there? I go... Right, so we're trying to figure out they're trying to attain the non-dual awareness by using all kinds of duality. And as my teacher, Trikinyim Rinpoche, likes to say, oldest son of Togurgen Rinpoche, likes to say, Zimbe Zimba Mi Pang, you can't get rid of grasping with more grasping. You can't get rid of duality with more duality. So anything I say, even if I, make a gesture, some holy gesture, or, and I'm gonna, here it is, and I'm gonna give you some special thing that's going to induce non-duality. It's like, no, it's all symbolic. So therefore, it's already dualistic. So how are you gonna do that? How? It's already there. I don't recognize it. Who's gonna help me to recognize it? Well, that's the lineage. And that then becomes where the lineage is really embodied experience with our lineage elders, with our teachers, our lineage ancestors. Passing from generation to generation to your own present teacher. Because the experience at least in the Mambuja Dzogchen tradition, the combined tradition that is kind of my home base, that in that lineage, this is just going to happen between people. And it's not going to be words, it's not going to be gestures, it's not going to be symbols, because all that is already dualistic. It's where there's this complete trust in a merger of the minds, so to speak. A merger of the embodied experience. Kind of a little bit like Hana's love, right, Roshi, from the Dharamsala talk, right? A little bit. So that, without that, it's hopeless from the non-dual perspective. So the lineage is crucially important, but it's not a matter of just kind of, becoming a vessel. If only it were that simple. It's also clearly not a matter of, doing everything new, making it all up. It's somewhere in between, where maybe we, someone teaches us how to make fire, and then we do something no one's thought of before with that. That changes our world. So, with all that in place, thank you for your attention. I hope that after my somewhat long day on campus, it wasn't too incoherent. And I look forward to spending the weekend with you. Thank you.
Thank you, dear John, so much. I think we're going to have a very rich time, considering, of course, the context that we're speaking from, which is in the simulated reality of our current political churn.
Indeed.
And I'm fascinated, John, also with you referring to the meeting with Dacker and company in relation to the indigenous view, which I hope we can touch into.
Great.
As well.
Wonderful.
Yes, thank you, John. I really got the impression of what Roshi talks about sometimes, about talking with a quantum physicist, and where he's talking and everything he says is like, yes, I totally get that. I totally get that. And then at the end, you're like, what did he just say?
Yeah, that was David.
Everything you said tonight, John, was right on. I loved it. And I really hope that those of you who aren't already in the program this weekend will join us. The link's in the YouTube page. Please join us. And John, thank you so much for many interesting points that I hope we can continue to explore about lineage and ancestry and our practice and all of that. We'll end with the 4 great vows.